She'd been living on a train station bench for 3 days, until a millionaire CEO stopped and asked the one question that changed everything. The train station was alive with a constant, restless noise, a blend of echoing announcements over loudspeakers, the clatter of luggage wheels against tile, the hiss of brakes as trains pulled in and out, and the sharp voices of travelers hurrying to their destinations. The smell of roasted coffee mixed with the faint metallic tang of iron and smoke from the tracks, a scent that lingered everywhere. It was a place designed for movement, for people coming and going, for beginnings and endings. Yet in the middle of all that motion sat a stillness that didn't belong. On a wooden bench, worn smooth from years of use, sat a little girl who looked too small and too fragile for the chaos around her. Her name was Lily Parker, though no one passing by knew it. She wore a red sweater that had once been bright but was now dulled with stains, and a blue denim skirt that did little to protect her from the draft that crept in through the open station doors. Her brown hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her wide brown eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking, as if she were waiting for something only she could see. At her side rested a tiny backpack, the kind children carried to kindergarten, faded at the seams and zipped shut as though it held every secret she possessed. For 3 days she had been here, sleeping curled up on the bench at night, surviving on bits of food offered by strangers who barely paused to ask questions. She never complained, never asked for help, because she had been told to do one thing and one thing only. Mom said, "Wait here," she whispered to herself for the 100th time, her voice barely audible above the station's noise. It was her mantra, her anchor, the only explanation she had. Her mother had taken her by the hand 3 days earlier, led her into the crowded station, pressed the backpack into her arms, and told her to stay on the bench until she returned. But her mother never came back. At first Lily counted the minutes, then the hours, watching people come and go, sure that any moment the familiar figure would appear in the crowd. As the second night turned into the third day, her hope had begun to dissolve, replaced by the dull ache of hunger and the hollow fear that she had been forgotten. Travelers noticed her in passing but assumed someone else must be looking after her. A security guard had asked once if she was waiting for her parents, and she nodded so firmly that he walked away without further thought. The world moved around her as though she were invisible, and perhaps that was what she had begun to believe, that she was part of the station itself, a piece of furniture no one questioned. Her legs ached from sitting so long, her eyes stung from lack of sleep, and yet she stayed rooted to the bench because leaving meant betraying the last instruction her mother had given her. By the third day, exhaustion pulled at her body, and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach grew almost unbearable. Still she sat upright, clutching the backpack to her chest, whispering again. Mom said, "Wait here." Her voice cracked now when she said it, the words no longer a promise but a fragile plea. And in that moment, as the station roared and hummed around her, she looked smaller than ever, like a child caught in a storm no one else could see, holding on to nothing but a fading command and the hope that someone, anyone, might finally notice her. Michael Hayes had never been the kind of man to linger in places like train stations. His world was one of private terminals, executive lounges, and limousines waiting at the curb, but that morning he had agreed to meet a government official whose train was delayed, and so he found himself stepping into the crowded, echoing space of Chicago's Union Station. Dressed in a light blue suit that fit him with effortless precision, his dark brown hair brushed back neatly, and his piercing blue eyes scanning the crowd, he looked every inch the executive he was. People turned to glance at him without knowing why, sensing the presence of someone who carried power like a second skin. He moved with the purpose of a man used to command, but for once, business was the last thing on his mind. As he passed the rows of benches, his attention snagged on something that felt out of place. Among the shifting, restless bodies of travelers, one figure remained utterly still. A little girl, far too young to be alone, sat hunched forward with a backpack pressed tightly against her chest. Her red sweater looked damp and wrinkled, her denim skirt clung to her knees, and her bare legs were smudged with dirt. She wasn't reading, wasn't fidgeting, wasn't doing what any normal child might do while waiting for a parent. She was simply staring straight ahead, her expression so blank it made Michael slow his pace without realizing. For a moment he thought she must be waiting for someone who would return any second, but then he saw the way her lips moved as if she were whispering something to herself. He stopped a few feet away, his sharp eyes narrowing, and in the cacophony of the station he caught the faintest sound. Mom said, "Wait here." The words carried no joy, no hope, only a mechanical repetition, like a prayer worn down to its bones. Michael felt a jolt in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years, and before he knew it he was moving closer. "Hey," he said gently, crouching down so his tall frame didn't tower over her. "Why are you sitting here all alone?" The girl looked up at him, and for the first time he saw her eyes, deep brown, wide and tired, filled with something that made him feel as though the ground beneath him had shifted. There was fear there, but also a desperate longing to be seen. She clutched the backpack tighter, her knuckles white, and whispered again, "Mom said, wait here." Michael searched her face, realizing this wasn't a child momentarily misplaced in a crowd. There was a stillness about her, a fragile resignation, that told him she had been here for much longer than she should have. He glanced around, scanning the people hurrying past, searching for someone who might step forward and claim her, but no one even slowed. She was invisible to them, an unnoticed shadow in the storm of movement. "How long have you been waiting?" he asked, his voice lower now, controlled, though inside he felt a growing unease. The girl didn't answer the question. Instead, her eyes dropped back to the floor, and she pressed her knees up under her chin. "Mom said." She began again, but her voice faltered, the words dissolving into silence. In that moment Michael understood that if he turned and walked away, no one else would stop. She would remain here, repeating her broken mantra until she disappeared into a system that would swallow her whole. And for reasons he could not yet explain, the thought of leaving her there was unbearable. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, took a slow breath, and said firmly but not unkindly, "Well, until your mom comes back, why don't you let me get you something warm to drink? It's cold here. You look like you could use a little comfort." Her eyes flickered back to his, doubtful but searching, and for the first time he saw something shift, a hesitation, a sliver of hope trying to break through the weight of her fear. She didn't nod, didn't speak, but her fingers loosened just slightly on the backpack. That was enough. Michael rose smoothly, holding out his hand. "Come on," he said softly. "Just for a little while." For a long, fragile moment, the girl didn't move. The station roared around them, trains screeched, people shouted, but between them there was only silence. Finally, with a small, trembling movement, she slid her tiny hand into his. Her palm was cold, her skin delicate against his, and the sensation ignited something fierce and protective in his chest. Michael straightened, her hand in his, and for the first time in years he felt that the meeting he had come for didn't matter at all. He was standing at the beginning of something much larger, something that would not just alter her life, but his as well. Michael guided the little girl through the bustling station, his tall frame sheltering her from the crush of bodies that seemed determined to sweep everything in their path. She held on to his hand with surprising strength, her grip more desperate than trusting, as if she was afraid that if she let go even for a second, she might vanish back into the shadows where no one noticed her. He didn't lead her too quickly, aware that her small legs had to scramble to keep pace with his long strides, but he also didn't linger. Every moment they remained there, he felt the pressure of eyes, real or imagined, judging him for walking away with a child who wasn't his. The stairs didn't matter. What mattered was the child beside him, shivering despite the warmth of the station, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. When they reached the small cafe tucked into the corner of the station, Michael chose a booth against the wall, one that gave them some privacy. The girl slid into the seat without a word, her wide eyes darting nervously over the menu board and the people bustling around them. Michael ordered hot cocoa and a sandwich, his voice steady but his mind whirling. This was not part of his life. He didn't sit in public cafes with children. He didn't take detours for strangers. His existence was carefully scheduled, meticulously structured, built on efficiency and control. And yet here he was, waiting for a cup of cocoa with a child who looked like she might break apart if he didn't hold her together. When the steaming mug was placed in front of her, she stared at it without moving. Michael nudged it gently toward her. "It's for you," he said, his tone calm, the same tone he used in negotiations when he wanted to reassure the other side. "Go ahead. It's warm." She glanced at him, then at the mug, and finally lifted it with both hands. The steam fogged her face, and for a moment she just inhaled the scent as though the heat alone was nourishment. Then she took a sip, cautious at first, then deeper, her small shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. Michael studied her carefully, trying to piece together the fragments of who she was and what had happened. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. Her voice was faint, but she answered. "Lily." He repeated it once under his breath, committing it to memory, because names mattered. Names made people real, and this child deserved to be seen as more than a shadow. "Lily," he said again, a little more firmly. "That's a beautiful name." She didn't smile, but her eyes flickered at the sound of it spoken with care. He pressed on gently. "How long have you been here, Lily?" Her gaze dropped to the table, and her fingers tightened around the mug. "Mom said wait," she murmured, as though repeating the words was safer than answering the question. "She said wait here and don't move. So I stayed." Michael felt the words hit him like a stone. The clarity of it, the obedience, the faith of a child who had trusted without question, it was devastating. He leaned back slightly, swallowing the anger that rose in his throat at the thought of a woman abandoning her daughter with nothing but a vague command. "You've been waiting a long time, haven't you?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Lily gave the faintest nod, her chin almost brushing the rim of the mug. Michael rubbed a hand over his jaw, trying to think clearly. He had expected to spend this day in meetings, talking about aircraft acquisitions and fuel contracts. Now, every part of him knew those concerns meant nothing compared to the small girl in front of him. She needed more than cocoa and sandwiches. She needed someone to decide she mattered. He felt a surge of determination so strong it startled him. "Lily," he said softly, drawing her attention back to him, "I don't think your mom is coming back. But that doesn't mean you're going to be alone. Not anymore." Her eyes widened, and for the first time he saw them shimmer with unshed tears. She bit her lip hard, as if trying to keep the emotions inside, and whispered, "She said she would come back." Michael leaned across the table, his voice steady but filled with something deeper than reassurance. "Sometimes people say things they can't keep. But I promise you this, right now, I'm here. And I'm not going to leave you sitting on that bench again." The tears finally broke free, rolling silently down her cheeks, but she didn't sob or wail. She just let them fall, her hands gripping the mug as though it was the only solid thing she had left. Michael reached across the table, not touching her hand but resting his palm on the wood where she could see it, an offer of steadiness without pressure. She glanced at it, then slowly, tentatively, placed her small hand on top of his. The warmth of her touch was fragile, but it struck him with the force of a promise. In that moment, Michael Hayes, a man who had built his life on numbers, power, and control, made a decision that had nothing to do with business. He would not abandon this child to a system that would chew her up and forget her name. He didn't know yet how he would explain it, what battles he would face, or how it would change his life, but he knew with absolute certainty that Lily's days of waiting were over. That night, long after he had taken her from the station, after he had driven her to the imposing mansion he called home and shown her a room she could hardly believe was hers, Michael found himself standing outside her door, listening to her small, steady breathing. She had fallen asleep clutching her backpack, as though afraid to let go of the last piece of her past. He leaned against the doorframe, the weight of what he had done settling over him. For once, he didn't think about the press, the shareholders, or the cost of his choices. All he could think about was the little girl asleep in his house, and the silent vow that had already taken root inside him: she would never wait alone again. The following morning began not with the usual rhythm of Michael Hayes's meticulously planned schedule but with the quiet, almost imperceptible sounds of another life moving through his house. He woke early, as always, though instead of immediately scanning through emails or reviewing financial reports, his mind was preoccupied with the memory of the little girl asleep down the hall. For years, his home had been a place of silence, its polished surfaces and immaculate order a reflection of his own carefully controlled world. Now that silence felt different, not empty but weighted with the fragile presence of someone who did not belong there yet seemed impossible to imagine leaving behind. He made coffee in the vast kitchen, the smell filling the air, and for once he didn't drink it while scanning the morning's market updates. Instead, he stood by the counter, listening. Eventually, he heard the creak of a door and the hesitant sound of small footsteps. Lily appeared in the doorway, her backpack still slung over one shoulder as if she was prepared to run at a moment's notice. Her red sweater hung wrinkled from sleep, and her brown eyes searched the kitchen cautiously. She looked at him as though unsure whether she was welcome in this space, as though every step forward needed silent permission. "Good morning," Michael said, keeping his voice even, softer than he was used to speaking. She nodded faintly but said nothing, her arms tightening around the straps of her bag. He gestured toward the table, trying not to make the moment too formal. "You can sit if you'd like. Are you hungry?" For a moment, she didn't move, but then she slid carefully into one of the chairs, her legs swinging above the floor. Michael opened the refrigerator and was struck by how useless most of its contents were in this situation. Bottles of imported water, selections of wine, cheeses delivered by specialty shops, his kitchen was stocked for executives, not for children. After searching, he found eggs, bread, and a small carton of milk. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with them, but he cracked the eggs into a pan, the sizzle breaking the silence. Lily watched him intently, her chin resting on her backpack, as though she were studying a foreign ritual. When he placed the plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her, she hesitated, staring at it as if waiting for permission. "It's for you," he said. "You don't have to ask." Slowly, she picked up the fork, her movements tentative, and took a small bite. She chewed carefully, then another, until her hunger overcame her hesitation and she ate in small, steady motions. Watching her, Michael felt something stir that he hadn't experienced in years. He had closed billion-dollar deals, addressed rooms filled with doubters, carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders, but never had anything felt as significant as the sight of a child quietly eating a meal he had made. It wasn't just the act itself, it was what it represented. She was beginning, however cautiously, to trust that she was safe enough to eat here, in his house, without fear of being told to leave. The day unfolded with the awkwardness of two people from completely different worlds forced into proximity. Lily followed him as he moved through the house, never more than a few steps behind, as though distance itself was dangerous. When he worked in his office, she sat on the rug by the door, pulling sheets of paper from the drawer and drawing with pens she found there. She hummed softly to herself, a small, wavering tune that seemed to fill the otherwise sterile room with life. Michael tried to focus on his emails but found his eyes drawn constantly back to her, to the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she sketched shapes and figures only she understood. Later that afternoon, he took her into the garden. The air was crisp after a night of rain, and the hedges, fountains, and manicured lawn stretched out like a magazine spread. But Lily didn't run across the grass or marvel at the sculptures. She simply stood, clutching her backpack, looking around with the same cautious gaze she had shown since he first met her. Michael realized then that his house, with all its grandeur, wasn't comforting to a child. It was cold, impressive but empty, a place designed to impress outsiders rather than nurture anyone inside. For the first time, he saw it through her eyes and understood just how lonely it had always been. As evening fell, Lily grew quieter. He showed her to the guest room prepared for her, with its large bed, clean sheets, and soft pillows. She nodded, sat down on the edge, and looked around silently. Later, when he checked on her, the bed was empty. Panic surged through him for a moment until he opened the wardrobe and found her curled inside, the backpack clutched against her chest. Her eyes were open, reflecting the dim hallway light. "Why don't you sleep in the bed?" he asked softly. She swallowed before answering, her voice no more than a whisper. "Because beds are where people find you. Closets are safer." The words pierced him, sharp and heavy. He crouched down, careful not to invade her space. "You don't have to hide here," he told her gently. "No one will hurt you in this house. Not while I'm here." She stared at him for a long time, her small hands gripping the straps of her bag. Then, in a voice fragile but clear, she asked, "Are you going to send me back?" The answer came without hesitation. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not sending you back. You're safe here." For the first time since he had met her, something shifted in her expression. Her eyes softened, her grip on the bag loosened just slightly, and though she didn't leave the closet, she moved enough to show she was listening, perhaps even beginning to believe him. Michael remained there for a long time after she drifted into sleep, the weight of what he had promised settling heavily on him. It wasn't just words. It was a vow, unspoken but binding, one that would shape both of their lives in ways he could not yet imagine. By the end of the week, Michael found himself entangled in a web of responsibilities he had never anticipated, and though his world had always been defined by contracts, mergers, and strategies, he now faced something far more complex and fragile. Child Services had called after reports from the station finally reached them, and officials demanded explanations. Questions came in rapid succession. Who was the girl? Why was she living in his home? What gave him the right to take her without notifying authorities immediately? Michael answered with calm precision, but beneath his measured tone was an undercurrent of frustration, because he knew that every delay in bureaucracy was time stolen from Lily's chance at stability. Lily sensed the tension even if she did not understand the intricacies of legal systems. She followed Michael from room to room, her small figure trailing him silently, always holding the straps of her backpack as though it were her armor. One evening, when he returned late from a meeting with his lawyers, he found her asleep in the hallway outside his study, curled up like a small animal waiting for its protector. He lifted her gently, carried her to bed, and as he tucked the blanket around her, he felt a surge of protectiveness unlike anything he had ever known. When the first official visit came, 2 social workers entered the house with sharp eyes and clipboards. They walked through the rooms with clinical detachment, noting every detail of the immaculate mansion. They asked Lily questions that seemed simple but were loaded with implication. Did she feel safe here? Did she want to stay? Lily's responses were brief, hesitant, but when she whispered that she didn't want to go back to the station, one of the workers looked up sharply, recognizing the gravity of her statement. Michael observed the entire exchange with a steady expression, but inside he burned with a mix of anger and resolve. No child should ever have to prove she deserved safety. That night, after the officials had left, Michael found Lily in the kitchen, perched on a stool with her knees drawn up to her chest. She was quiet for a long time before she finally asked, "Are they going to take me away?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and Michael sat beside her, leaning his arms on the counter so his posture matched hers. "Not if I can stop it," he said firmly. "And I promise you, Lily, I will fight to stop it." She studied him carefully, as though trying to decide if his words were stronger than the empty promises she had heard before. When she finally rested her head against his arm, he knew that she was beginning to believe him, even if only a little. The following days brought more revelations. Through private investigators, Michael uncovered the truth about Lily's mother. Arrest records confirmed that she had been taken into custody shortly after abandoning her daughter at the station. The charges were severe: possession, distribution, and multiple prior offenses. The realization hit Michael with a strange duality of relief and sorrow: relief that his instinct to protect Lily had been justified, and sorrow that her life had been shaped by neglect so profound it bordered on cruelty. He wondered how long she had endured chaos and instability before her mother's final betrayal. But even as the legal documents painted a bleak picture, Lily herself began to change in subtle ways. She started leaving her backpack behind in certain rooms, a quiet signal that she no longer believed she needed to guard it every second. She ate meals without hesitation and began asking questions, small ones at first, about the pictures on the walls, about the strange piano in the corner of the living room, about the dog she had seen outside through the window but was too shy to approach. One evening, she asked if she could try the piano. Her fingers struck the keys clumsily, the sound discordant, but the look on her face as the notes filled the room was enough to make Michael forget the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. It was in those moments that he realized he had crossed an invisible line. What had begun as an impulsive act of compassion at the train station had become something permanent in his mind. He no longer thought of Lily as someone he was helping until the system took over. He thought of her as his. The word felt foreign and frightening, but also inevitable. He understood that the courts might not see it that way, that officials might try to place her elsewhere, but he was already committed. She was no longer just a child he had rescued, she was part of him now, stitched into the rhythm of his days and the quiet corners of his heart. Late that night, as he sat in his study surrounded by files and papers, Michael stared at the documents that detailed Lily's bleak past and possible futures. The weight of them was crushing, but when he glanced toward the door and imagined her asleep down the hall, he knew there was no alternative. He would not let her go to an orphanage. He would not let her vanish into the statistics of a broken system. He would stand in every courtroom, face every challenge, and if necessary, give up the life he had built to ensure hers was safe. For the first time in decades, his future was no longer measured in profits or power but in the fragile trust of a little girl who had waited too long for someone to keep their promise. The morning of the hearing dawned with a cold rain that seemed to seep into every corner of the city, as if the weather itself mirrored the gravity of what was about to unfold. Michael dressed more carefully than usual, choosing a darker suit, not out of vanity but because he wanted to appear composed, grounded, and immovable. Lily sat on the edge of her bed as he tied his tie, her backpack resting in her lap, though by now he knew she carried it less out of necessity and more out of habit. She had placed a small stuffed rabbit inside along with the photograph of her mother, talismans of a past she both clung to and feared. When he asked if she was ready, she looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her 6 years and said quietly, "Are they going to make me go back?" He crouched in front of her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "I told you before, Lily. I'm not letting anyone send you away. You belong with me now." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a vow he had repeated silently every day since meeting her. The courthouse was vast and intimidating, with stone walls that seemed to stretch into the clouds. Inside, the air was thick with murmurs, papers rustling, and the heavy echo of footsteps against marble floors. Michael walked with Lily beside him, his hand firm around hers, guiding her through the maze of hallways. He could feel her small fingers trembling, but she didn't pull away. When they entered the courtroom, she immediately stiffened at the sight of the rows of unfamiliar faces, officials with solemn expressions, and the elevated bench where the judge presided. The atmosphere was not cruel but clinical, a place where lives could be decided in the space of a few words. The proceedings began with the usual formality, the clerk reading names, lawyers standing to present their arguments, the prosecutor outlining the legal impossibility of a man like Michael keeping custody of a child with whom he shared no blood relation. They painted him as a wealthy man swept up in a temporary impulse, someone playing savior for the sake of an image. They warned of instability, of precedent, of the dangers of bypassing the system. Michael listened without reaction, his face calm, though inside his anger simmered with every word that reduced Lily to a case number rather than a child with a soul. When his turn came, he rose and spoke not like an executive used to commanding boardrooms, but like a man who had stripped himself of titles and power. He described the day he found her, the way she had whispered, "Mom said, wait here," with the vacant eyes of someone who had already been forgotten. He explained how he had taken her in not for show or charity but because walking away was impossible, because in that moment she had ceased being a stranger and had become someone whose life was bound to his. His words were steady, unembellished, but they carried a force the lawyer's rehearsed arguments could not replicate. The judge listened, expression unreadable, and then asked if the child wished to speak. The room grew still, every breath held as Lily was guided to the stand. She looked impossibly small against the towering wooden seat, her legs too short to reach the ground. She held her backpack tightly, her voice barely above a whisper at first. "I waited for Mom," like she said, but she didn't come back. "I was hungry and cold, and nobody talked to me until he did." She glanced at Michael, her eyes softening. "He gave me food and a bed, and he doesn't get mad when I'm quiet. He listens when I talk. I don't want to go anywhere else. I want to stay with him." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument presented that day. There was no drama in her words, no grand declarations, only the simple truth of a child who knew the difference between neglect and care. Even the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, sensing the futility of pushing further. The judge nodded, thanking Lily, and she climbed down carefully, her eyes darting to Michael as if seeking reassurance. He gave her the smallest nod, pride and tenderness mingling in his chest, and she returned to sit beside him, her hand slipping naturally back into his. When the session ended, the judge did not give an immediate ruling, but Michael knew that something had shifted. Lily's voice had cut through the layers of procedure and revealed what mattered most. They left the courthouse together, stepping into the rain that still fell steadily, and as he opened the umbrella over them, Lily leaned closer to him, resting her head against his side. She didn't say anything, but the way she relaxed told him more than words ever could. For the first time in her short, turbulent life, she was beginning to believe in permanence, in the idea that someone would stay no matter what battles had to be fought. That night, as she drifted to sleep in her bed with the rabbit tucked under her arm, Michael stood by her doorway longer than usual. The shadows of the day still clung to him, the memory of arguments and accusations, but they were tempered by the image of her voice filling the courtroom, clear and unwavering. He realized then that this wasn't just his fight anymore, it was theirs. She had stood for herself, and together they had made the world listen. And in that realization, he found a new kind of strength, one that had nothing to do with wealth or power but everything to do with love. Weeks passed after the first hearing, and though the judge had not yet delivered a final ruling, the weight of uncertainty lingered over Michael's household like a storm cloud that refused to break. Lily had begun to settle into a rhythm of life in his home. She attended school with the help of a private tutor, she explored the garden without clutching her backpack quite so tightly, and sometimes in the evening she even laughed at small things, like when the dog chased his tail or when Michael burned a piece of toast trying to make breakfast. Yet beneath those glimpses of normal childhood, there was still a quiet fear in her eyes every time the phone rang or when strangers came to the door. She was too young to understand legal processes, but she understood enough to know that people still had the power to take her away. It was during this fragile time that the greatest challenge emerged. Lily's biological mother, recently released on bail, appeared in court filings demanding her daughter's return. The claim was framed as repentance. She said she was ready to rebuild her life, to be a mother again, and her lawyers argued passionately about the sanctity of biological ties. The papers arrived one evening in a thick envelope, delivered by courier, and Michael read them alone in his study, the words burning into his mind with a cold fury. The woman who had abandoned her child on a station bench for days, who had chosen addiction and crime over responsibility, now sought to reclaim her simply because blood connected them. Michael's hands tightened on the edge of his desk until his knuckles went white, because he knew that no piece of paper could erase what Lily had endured. The next morning, he did not hide the truth from Lily. He believed she deserved honesty, even if it hurt. He sat with her in the library, the soft light filtering through the tall windows, and explained in careful words that her mother wanted to see her again. At first Lily's face brightened, because even after all that had happened, part of her heart still yearned for the woman who had given her life. But as Michael spoke about the court, about the arguments, her expression shifted. She pressed her arms tightly around her backpack and whispered, "If she takes me, do I have to go back to the station?" The innocence of the question struck him like a blow, because it revealed how she still measured safety by the terror of that place. He pulled her gently into his arms and said, "No one is ever taking you back there. Not now, not ever. I will fight for you with everything I have." She nodded, though tears welled in her eyes, and he realized she was learning the painful truth that love and longing could coexist with betrayal. The hearing that followed was more intense than the first. The courtroom was filled with tension as Lily's mother appeared, her hair unkempt, her hands shaking slightly, her voice wavering between remorse and defensiveness. She told the judge she loved her daughter, that she had made mistakes but wanted another chance. Michael sat silently at first, his jaw tight, but when asked to respond, he rose with a calmness that concealed the fire inside him. He did not attack Lily's mother outright, instead, he spoke of the child herself. He described how Lily had been found shivering, whispering the same phrase over and over, abandoned in a place no child should ever be left. He explained the nightmares that woke her in the night, the way she hid in closets because she believed that was the only place she could be safe. And then he looked directly at the judge and said, "Being a parent is not about biology. It is about presence. It is about keeping a promise when a child has no one else to trust. I made that promise, and I intend to keep it." The words hung in the air, heavier than any legal argument. The judge studied him, then turned to Lily, who had been sitting quietly beside her appointed advocate. She was asked once more what she wanted, and though her voice trembled, she spoke clearly. "My mom left me at the station. She told me to wait, but she never came back. He came. He stayed. I want to stay with him." Her small voice echoed through the courtroom, shattering whatever illusion remained about where she belonged. Even those who had come prepared to argue for procedure found themselves silent, because the truth was undeniable when spoken by the child herself. Afterward, outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed with questions, but Michael ignored them, focusing only on Lily. She clung to his hand as if afraid the world might try to pull her away again. He bent down, his voice firm but gentle, and said, "I told you I wouldn't let them take you. And I meant it." For the first time since he had met her, she smiled through her tears, the fragile, radiant smile of someone beginning to believe she was no longer temporary, no longer unwanted. That night, when she asked if she could sleep without her backpack by her side, Michael realized they had crossed another invisible threshold. The fight was not yet finished, but the bond between them had already been sealed, stronger than any bloodline, stronger than any doubt. The day of the final ruling arrived with a brightness that felt almost cruel, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of the courthouse as if mocking the anxiety that weighed on Michael's shoulders. He had faced boardrooms filled with rivals, government officials demanding answers, and investors ready to pull millions, but nothing in his career had ever made him feel the way he did walking through those doors with Lily's hand in his. She was dressed in a simple navy dress chosen by the court-appointed guardian, her hair neatly brushed into braids, but she still clutched the strap of her backpack like a rope connecting her to stability. Her steps were small and measured, her eyes darting toward every unfamiliar face, and Michael bent down once before entering the courtroom to whisper, "Remember what I told you. Whatever happens in there, you are not alone." She nodded slightly, her lips pressing together, and slipped her hand tighter into his. Inside, the air was heavy with formality. Lawyers arranged their notes in neat stacks, clerks shuffled papers, and the judge sat poised, his expression unreadable. Michael took his seat with Lily beside him, and as the proceedings began, he felt every eye in the room shift toward them. The prosecutor once more emphasized the lack of biological connection, arguing that precedent and procedure could not bend for sentiment. The words felt hollow, as though they had been spoken too many times before in other cases, reducing children to case numbers and families to technicalities. Michael's attorney countered with equal force, presenting evidence of Lily's well-being since moving into his home, her medical reports, her improved health, her gradual steps toward security. Yet the moment that silenced the room came not from legal arguments but from Lily herself. The judge asked if she wished to speak one last time, and though her small hands trembled as she walked to the stand, she lifted her chin with a courage that stunned even Michael. "I waited like my mom said," she began, her voice steady but soft, "but she didn't come back. I thought maybe she forgot me, but he found me. He gave me food, he gave me a bed, and he didn't leave. I don't want to wait anymore. I want to go home with him." The courtroom was quiet enough to hear the rustle of a single page turning. Her words carried no legal jargon, no practiced phrasing, only the undeniable truth of a child who had learned too early the cost of broken promises. The judge leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and for several long moments no one moved. Then, with a clear voice that carried authority and finality, he announced his decision. "In the matter of Lily Parker, guardianship and custody are hereby granted to Michael Hayes. Effective immediately, she is placed in his permanent care." The gavel struck, and though the sound was sharp and brief, it reverberated through Michael's chest like a thunderclap. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and when he looked down, Lily was staring at him with wide eyes. "Does that mean," she whispered, almost afraid to finish. Michael nodded, pulling her close. "Yes. It means you're home. Forever." When they left the courthouse, the swarm of cameras and reporters waited, but Michael barely noticed them. The world could make headlines about a billionaire adopting a child from a train station, but those words meant nothing compared to the quiet certainty in his heart. Lily walked beside him, no longer clutching her backpack quite so tightly, her steps lighter than they had ever been. For the first time, she wasn't bracing for someone to take her hand away, she was holding on because she wanted to. That evening, back at the house, Michael found her sitting at the piano, her small fingers pressing hesitant notes. The sound was uneven, but her face glowed with concentration. He stood in the doorway, watching her, feeling something he hadn't felt in decades, peace. When she turned to him, she asked, "Can I call you Dad now?" The question pierced through every layer of armor he had ever built around himself. He crossed the room, kneeling beside her, and said simply, "You already do. You've been mine from the moment I found you." She threw her arms around him, and for the first time he felt her hug without hesitation, fierce and unguarded. Later, as he tucked her into bed, she no longer asked if she would be sent away, no longer curled up inside a closet, no longer needed to whisper to herself to believe in safety. Instead, she whispered one new phrase, soft and certain, before her eyes closed in sleep. I have a dad now. Michael sat by her side for a long time, the house quiet around them, and realized that everything he had once thought defined his life, his company, his fortune, his status, was nothing compared to this moment. The little girl he had found waiting in a train station had changed him forever, not by asking for power or money, but simply by needing someone who would not walk away. And in giving her that promise, he had discovered that she had given him something even greater in return, a reason to finally feel whole.